The Chinese have a proverb that states, "May you live in interesting times." And it's not meant in a complimentary way that may your life and the environment around you be interesting. It's meant as something of a warning or taken in a negative context. And we definitely are living through interesting times. I voted yesterday in the 2025 federal election, so I thought today was as good a time as ever to make a video on the current state of the Australian collective, the egregore, or the collective consciousness here in Australia, which we are all a part of, as much as people would like to think that they reject mainstream views or views of the consensus or the majority. We're still all connected to the collective conscious mind, which is in a state of extreme distress, uncertainty, and the state is intensifying as we're moving through this global shift. The collective is now starting to question assumed belief systems, assumed narratives, and the consensus reality, which is extremely confronting for the people of Australia as a collective. Now, I'm not speaking about people in Australia who are perhaps on this awakening journey or are more conscious or more self-aware. When I talk about the Australian collective, I'm talking about all of us, each one of us, how we contribute to this melting pot of consciousness, to this egregore, which is a Greek word. And we're really now at the precipice where the collective is starting to shift, and it's really a case of looking at things with the glass being half full or is it half empty. Now, depending on your perspective, the chaos that is unfolding in the collective and in Australia, regardless of the outcome of the election, will only intensify. We are faced with a mounting number of problems that are not solvable in the short term. I talked about this as being 2024, the year of convergence, in my yearly forecast, and 2025 being the point of no return. And we have definitely got here in some ways actually faster than what I had actually anticipated. So what does that mean where we're heading collectively? Well, the Australian people have actually never been through what I would call a rite of passage into adulthood. We've come from a very, particularly if you grew up in the 60s, 70s and 80s, to put that in context for this video, which is of course my generation, Generation X, even the boomers. You can also perhaps classify it as very, very early millennials, but I would suggest no. But late silent generation, boomers, Gen X, this sort of period, not what I would refer to as the Australia of today, or definitely not Gen Z or anyone born past the millennium. And what we've seen is a change of values, a change in the social fabric, and a change in the consensus reality. And it's proving to be very challenging because our traditional way of living, of thinking, of being with this she'll be right attitude is now turning out to be extremely dysfunctional, and it's actually, this attitude is actually surmounting the problems and contributing to the collective problems, because we have had this relaxed attitude actually used against us as a collective. And in the national ethos, this sort of attitude of easygoing, relaxed attitude, which is very beautiful, by the way. And you really, when, at least for me, when I travel overseas, I really start to see the amazing qualities of the Australian collective soul, the Australian egregore, and everything that we've got to contribute, and the qualities that are looked fondly upon by people around the world, which has always made Australia such a great place to live, and at least in my view, such a fantastic place to grow up. We've had economic security, we've had security in terms of, geopolitics, and allying ourselves with very powerful countries, nations, obviously originally England, and then moving more to a post-World War II stronger relationship with the US, which have all been beneficial to Australia. And now this has been challenged because the Anglo-American Empire is in terminal decline, which means the shifting alliances and the geopolitical changes that are occurring around the world are affecting us. They're creating a lot of uncertainty, and our traditional way of looking at life and so on is also being impacted on that. And it means that we are left wondering what the way forward is. And that is really defining the collective consensus of the egregore in Australia at the moment in a number of different ways, which I'll get into with some things. Other things I'll keep pretty brief. This is pretty windy today, so I'm not sure if the wind is going to impact on the sound, so I hope it doesn't. So this rite of passage, what does this mean? Well, the way I look at this, the best analogy I can express this is this film, The Truman Show, with Jim Carrey. Truman Burbank is the main character. It's a fascinating story of Truman's own awakening to reality, which Australians have been able to avoid this to some degree, but we are now in the process of this compressed evolution, this collective evolution, obviously individual spiritual evolution as well. And I'm talking about this from the big picture, because if you're just going to zoom in and look at voting patterns in the election or policies and these sorts of things, you won't really understand the overview of what's really happening, because the tinkering around of, you know, various policies of the uni party and so on, it's not really going to make a big difference to the really difficult period that we face now over the next 5 years, could be 10 years, minimum 5 years. That's really unstoppable. And it's because this sort of safe haven of basically having this really great way of life, of having a public policy that supported good lifestyle, protected our values, all these sorts of things, which I would say are historical in the context that a lot of these values have been eroded during my lifetime, ways of thinking, ways of living, and so on. But it depends if you look at that as being good or bad, because coming from a solid foundation, which we have for growth, is important for any child through their maturing into adulthood. We've had that, but we haven't taken the next step, which is this rite of passage, which is this basic growth into adulthood. We've never had the kind of challenges that you look at in different countries, whether it's Eastern Europe, even England to a degree, the US, definitely a lot of Western European nations, and many other countries around the world, whether it's Southeast Asia, so on. And this means, and I'm talking about in the modern context of Australia, post-Federation, post-First Fleet, just to give that some sort of definition there. And it means that we've had a very sheltered, privileged way of living, and we don't really understand the shifting values of what's occurring around the world now. And the crisis that's occurring is actually an invitation for us to step into adulthood. And it didn't need to be this way, but because the collective spectacularly failed the tests that were provided for the collective in the pandemic and so on, that now this is the desire to have the she'll be right mate attitude, put our head in the sand, avoid, ignore, check out, numb out from all these problems, has now come front and center. And this is at an evolutionary crossroads, or at least an evolutionary pathway for us to forge into adulthood at a rapid rate. Now, we're not even close to getting there in terms of consciousness in Australia. And this is reflected in a whole lot of things. But because there are so many problems that are converging now, there is the opportunity for rapid transformation. So, as I said, this is the potential that we have in front of us. Will we take it? We won't unless we start to lucidly see, you know, what are our values that we want to defend? What is our way of life we want to protect? What sort of innovation do we want to have economically as a country? You know, how do we want to support innovation, dynamism, entrepreneurship? How do we have a good tax structure for corporations? These sorts of things. And really difficult conversations that we are excellent at avoiding in Australia, and that's why we haven't ever gone through this rite of passage. Some people would argue that that's not true. The legend of the Gallipoli and the Anzacs was a rite of passage. As amazing as the legend of the Anzacs was, and their contribution into the egregore is very strong. It's still strong over 100 years later, which is one of the great things that I personally love about Australia, is what they embodied in terms of mateship, courage, service and sacrifice. It's not gone into the modern day collective in the same way. I won't go and explain why I think that is the case, but it's like the embers are still there, but the raging fire of courage is not burning in the Australian heart, as we saw how compliant, how complicit, how basically emasculated the population was under the tyranny and government overreach of the pandemic, and even in the context of some of the information coming out that lockdowns were not advised on medical information, and there's still no outrage, there's still no calls for accountability in the collective, and if they are, they're a very small number of people. So that's the important thing to think about with the collective, is that there's segments of the collective that may have certain views and beliefs and opinions, but overall then we're looking at how things really show up. So we've shown that we are exceptionally naive. That's in the Australian collective without a doubt. We are gullible. We are easy to manipulate, as the mainstream media has proven again and again and again. And we have continued this mass formation psychosis of the collective post-COVID. And that's really obvious, and that will be shown again in this election. So I'll go through a few statistics to show you why I think that the collective consciousness here is not ready for any real major shift yet. And that's in terms of the election that we are facing tomorrow. Tomorrow is going to be a very interesting day. And I think there'll be a lot of positives that will come from this election, but it's a reflection of the collective will. And in fact, the election, federal election, is one of the key moments of the expression of the collective to take the temperature of the mood of the complete Australian population, at least the voters, let's put it like that, at least people who are registered to vote. So this is a big thing. It's one of the biggest things. You could see something else in history. Australia, like the Sydney Olympics, for example, was an example of the big collective energy here in Australia. There's been other things, nothing coming to my mind right now, but elections is one of the big ones, much bigger than even sporting events, and even post-Sydney Olympics. I think that the overall collective is shifting away from this patriotism in sport, as it's dominated by corporations, by money, and also by this woke attitude that's displayed and proud there, whereas many people don't feel that represents them anymore, which is basically one of the real key issues we have here, is the introduction of a lot of socialist policies in Australia. That's what they are, and Australians are far more socialist than what they even can possibly understand. I mean, this desire for all these welfare payments and free money and abuse of really good things like the NDIS, which is supposed to help people in need, all these sort of things. Basically, who's paying for that? And when the government are saying that we're going to spend, no, that's our money that they're spending. That's our money, and never forget that. So when the government borrow money, they're putting us by default in debt as the population. And this is part of the issues that we have not confronted as a collective properly. And we are heading into this, uni-party, two wings of the same bird mentality that will just try another one. And meanwhile, the baton just gets passed from one leader to another with the same agenda being rolled out. So what I'm saying here is that if you look, for example, how this dominates the collective consciousness, the Queensland election in 2024, as a primary vote, LNP got 41%, Labor 32%. So that's a total of 73% of people in Queensland at the last state election voted for either Liberal or Labor. Now, this is also reflected in the recent Werribee by-election, where Labor got 28% of the vote. In WA, in their recent state election, Labor got 41% of the vote, which was a swing 18% against Labor, by the way, and 28% for LNP, which is a total of 69%. So those two totals, 69%, 73%, show that approximately, let's say 30% roughly, people are still not voting for the Uni Party. Now, whatever you think of elections and voting and all the rest of it, that is not relevant for the point I'm making now. What I am making is the idea that still overwhelming majority are looking to these two-party preferred preferential voting system as a solution. Now, in this election, I think that this is going to drop significantly, and you might see the two-party preferred Labor Liberal total as primary vote as low as 65%. So this means that there is an awakening occurring, but is very slow, and it is a realization that, I'm getting rained on, that this Liberal Labor leadership has failed Australia. Now, this is just one aspect of the collective shift and so on that's occurring. There's a lot more to that, but it takes into account the idea of the hive mind. And the hive mind basically is just completely indoctrinated into collective views, belief systems, values that have been impregnated into it. So people who are indoctrinated in this way, they believe that they form their own opinion by, for example, watching the mainstream media, listening to mainstream radio, or reading mainstream newspapers, or current affairs shows, whatever. But the truth is that these people don't form any of their own particular values or opinions. They're like literally programmed through repetition, through this idea of identifying with certain celebrities or journalists or popular figures to help support the narrative that people are being impregnated in their mind. It's a very sophisticated process, and it is basically based on the principle of repetition. And that's why the collective is very easy to have these social engineering values, which we're seeing particularly with this wokeism, this left wing, which is in essence just cultural Marxism. And it means that people are not forming their own ideas. They're the ideas of the collective. And the collective doesn't necessarily have to be bad, but it is if it's used, or the ideas being impregnated in people are not positive in this way. So this means that this continuation of this mass formation is still happening now, because so few people have learnt enough of the lessons of the spiritual evolutionary pathways that are relevant, that they were personally invited to learn from and grow from during the pandemic, which didn't occur. And this is a defining feature that will go on a loop until people start to question the narrative. And it's happening here in Australia. The only two other countries I could directly compare us to in this way would be Canada and New Zealand. And in other ways, we can compare the other countries in the Anglo-American Empire, but in this way, it's starting to happen. And when the needle moves, the whole collective moves. And that's the positive part. So when you sit there and say, well, I know people that are never going to understand geopolitics, or how they're being manipulated, or how they're being programmed or indoctrinated, well, they don't have to. And that's the beauty of the collective, because if enough of the collective shifts, then those people's belief systems are changed automatically, because they are so part of the hive mind. And I've made other videos speaking about this in depth more, that they don't have their own values. They simply absorb the values of the hive mind, whether it's all kind of values, social engineered values around things like, I don't know, climate change or net zero, whatever it is. If the collective shifts its values around that, or preserving Australian values in whatever particular context, then those people are just absorb those belief systems. And So therefore, the shifting of the collective, it can work in a positive way, the hive mind. It's not necessarily negative this way. It's negative in this way at the moment because the collective consciousness here in Australia is very low, and that's expressed as how easily it is to manipulate the collective mind. And for this reason, we haven't gone through this rite of passage. We are very naive, we are very gullible, we are very trusting, and these things are all the beautiful qualities of a child, but they're not the mature qualities of an adult who's prepared to defend what they believe in, to stand up for what they know to be right, to have their voice heard. And again, this is another quality of the Australian collective, is that we don't really like to make a fuss. Like, we don't like to sort of, make a scene or complain or something like that. We're not, those values we don't have so much in the egregore. But this she'll be right, mate attitude, which has very beautiful qualities in a way, it's been used against us. And you can see this in this emasculated culture here in Australia, which was became very obvious and transparent during the pandemic. So where does that leave us with? Well, unfortunately, I have to say that we are in for an extremely challenging and difficult time as a collective. Now, this doesn't mean that you personally cannot thrive in the chaos. And this is something that I'm running workshops on. I do coaching on. If you want to know more about it, then get in contact with me, because I don't feel that it's necessary for everyone to suffer in the same way, but at the same time, we're still connected to the collective. It's a much more, in my view, an integrated and sophisticated path to take the path of sovereignty, take the path of autonomy, but then contribute back to the collective in the way you feel called to support the collective. The timelines are splitting in consciousness here and around the world, and it's unstoppable at this point, particularly with things like the acceleration of the pole shift and these sorts of events that are occurring. But you don't have to be in this same boat as everybody else in this way. We are autonomous in this way, but we want to thrive in the chaos, and that is the real challenge ahead of us. For the collective, it's like a coming of age, it's like a rite of passage, it's a ceremony into adulthood that we as Australia will forge the way forward, because the Australia that I grew up in the 70s and 80s, that's finished, that's gone, that's not coming back. The real question is, what is the way forward for us as a nation, as a collective consciousness? Where do we go from here? And as things stand today, that question's unanswered. People are expecting some sort of profound shift in this election that's occurring tomorrow. It will not happen. There will be some big wins. There will be a trend away from the Liberal-Labor vote, first preference, primary vote, but it's a sign. And this collective shift, it can happen quickly, but it means there has to be a transformation of consciousness before the shift happens. It's like it's followed by this. And the election is just one thing. It's just one example of the collective consciousness. I would not pay too much attention to it. It's really important to get on thriving in your own life, contribute where you can, because this paradigm is failing. The more difficult things become in Australia, the more the awakening will accelerate at the same time, and it will be an awakening born from hardship, from suffering. It doesn't have to be that way, but we've kind of crossed the threshold where now, I wouldn't say it's too late, but we're at the point where the inevitable is going to occur. Our way of life that we thrived in times gone before the GFC and so on, that's finished. And we need to look to the future, whatever that looks like, for you and for me. So that's pretty much everything I wanted to say. But final point is that on this topic of the election, this is the first election where the Gen Y and Gen Z will outnumber the boomers at the ballot box. And the future, at least in terms of politics and the elections and the nature of the political system, really now lies at the hands of the younger people. And so dismissing them as being entitled or woke or lazy or materialistic, it's not going to help at all. What's more powerful is try to understand their worldview, educate them on the values of that we want to preserve in our culture, in the egregore, and to make them become financially literate, and also to study history to see where these socialist values and where money printing ends up, which is where we're headed to. And this is really something that needs to be looked at positively, because the day of the boomers dominating the ballot box and a lot of policies that will support housing growth and so on, they're coming to an end. That doesn't mean it's coming to an end in this election, but you're going to see the rise of the dominance of the values and the principles of the younger people. And we need to get on board with how they see the world, which is difficult because they have been come through a time of really huge economic growth and a lot of success in a lot of ways, Australia, and this is ending now. So they are starting to see the difficulties that lie ahead, and their voting patterns will reflect that. So this outdated dinosaur way of looking at the world, it's going to create its own problems if we do not support and educate the younger people. I'm talking about basically under 40 now, and to listen and try to understand, because the older voting patterns are one of the primary reasons we've got ourselves into the mess that we have, and that's the bottom line. And there needs to be some responsibility and accountability for that, because the younger people are growing up in a world where now a whole generation is not entirely, but a lot of it is locked out of home ownership. And what is that going to look like for them in 10 years, 20 years time? So that's pretty much a lot to think about. I'll do a follow-up video for this one post the election, hopefully, if I get time, and we'll digest the outcome of this election. It's very interesting to see the egregore shift, evolve, transform. But here in Australia, we are under now evolutionary pressure, and as we know, it's this evolutionary pressure, this pressure on the coal that gives birth to the diamond. So good luck, everybody. We live in epic times.